April 1945. A government building near Erfurt, Germany. Dust settles in a dark basement as American boots crunch across shattered glass and discarded paperwork. Soldiers search the dim concrete corridors for any remaining enemy holdouts, their flashlights cutting through the damp air. A military intelligence officer stops in front of a solid stone wall, holding a blueprint under his arm. He studies the masonry, glances down at his tape measure, and frowns. Something is wrong with the dimensions. He raises his fist and knocks hard on the stone. The dull thud reveals a deep, hollow echo hidden within the foundations. Behind this false wall lies a massive secret room. This room holds a terrifying collection of floor-to-ceiling filing cabinets. General George Patton will soon stand in this exact basement, and his response will turn this hidden vault into an unyielding weapon of absolute justice. This is the story of how General George S. Patton uncovered a secret, climate-controlled archive of mass murder hidden behind a basement wall in Germany. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show the evidence no order could erase. First Lieutenant Thomas Gutierrez was a 26-year-old military intelligence officer from San Antonio, Texas, serving with the Third Army. Before the war pulled him across the Atlantic, he had spent 3 years studying structural engineering and architecture at a university in his home state. This technical background gave him a unique eye for layouts, blueprints, and physical spaces, a skill that made him invaluable for detecting hidden installations. He had seen the brutal reality of combat across France and into the heart of Germany, losing close friends to sniper fire and artillery barrages. These losses deeply hardened his resolve to uncover every hidden layer of the regime his unit was dismantling. His sharp eye for structural anomalies was exactly what led him to notice the missing 6 feet in the basement floor plan. Regierungsrat Helmut Brenner was a 50-year-old regional administrator from Berlin who oversaw the regional bureaucracy of the state. He believed entirely in absolute organizational efficiency, viewed his work through the lens of pure administrative duty, and often stated that a well-kept record was the highest form of status. He enjoyed the unearned privileges of his rank, wearing a custom-tailored civilian suit made of fine wool, polished leather shoes, and a golden party badge pinned neatly to his lapel. Even as the front lines crumbled and American tanks entered the district, he remained inside the complex to ensure his filing cabinets were locked and secure. He viewed the thousands of systematically recorded deaths not as a horrific moral atrocity, but merely as successfully completed paperwork that required proper archival preservation. He was a cold bureaucrat who filed systemic genocide with the exact same detached precision that an ordinary accountant used for corporate tax returns. By April 1945, the European theater was rapidly collapsing into chaotic fragments. Allied divisions were racing across Germany, shattering the final defensive lines of a regime that was disintegrating by the hour. Entire cities were surrendering to advancing armor columns while local government offices burned their files, abandoned their posts, and fled into the countryside. Communication networks were severed, supply lines were utterly broken, and the central command structure in Berlin had lost all control over regional territories. In this environment of total collapse, American frontline units frequently encountered administrative vacuums where local offices were left completely intact, abandoned by officials who assumed their secrets would be buried under the rubble of a fallen nation. Many American commanders focused entirely on maintaining momentum and capturing high-ranking combat generals, often overlooked the civilian administration buildings they passed. Military investigators routinely swept these structures quickly, looking only for hidden enemy snipers, weapon stockpiles, or map rooms before moving their troops forward. Dozens of regional offices were cleared within minutes, their locked basements and dense paperwork mountains left for secondary units to process weeks later. Some frontline officers simply accepted the superficial cooperation of low-level clerks, leaving complex municipal archives completely unexamined in the rush to secure strategic crossroads. This general haste allowed many local bureaucrats to destroy sensitive records or simply walk away from their desks unnoticed by the advancing forces. But the regional administrative complex near Erfurt would not be bypassed so easily by the intelligence detachments of the Third Army. Lieutenant Gutierrez stood in that dim basement corridor, ignoring the superficial cooperation of the building staff as he studied his architectural drawings. Lieutenant Gutierrez called for the build foreman and a hidden clerk who had been found crouching behind a boiler. The clerk, a thin man in a worn gray tunic, stepped forward into the dim flashlight beams. Gutierrez pointed directly at the newly discovered breach in the brickwork, demanding an explanation for the unmapped void. The clerk blinked against the light and shrugged his shoulders, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses with a trembling hand. He stated that it was simply an old structural reinforcement wall, built before the war began. He claimed the space behind it was empty dead space, containing nothing but support columns and old water pipes. Gutierrez held up the municipal blueprint, tracing the solid lines with a heavy finger. He noted that the external measurements differed by exactly 6 feet from the internal length of the corridor. He ordered the clerk to produce the keys or tools to clear the structural obstruction immediately. The clerk looked back at the masonry, his posture stiffening as he shook his head. He argued that the military authorities had no right to damage public administrative property. He insisted that municipal regulations strictly forbade unauthorized entry into structural foundations without proper civil permits. Gutierrez waved his arm, signaling 2 nearby infantrymen who were carrying heavy iron sledges. He commanded his men to break through the center of the false brick wall without further delay. The heavy hammers swung forward, smashing through the plaster and hollow brick with a succession of deafening impacts. A jagged hole collapsed inward, releasing a sudden draft of chilled, dry air into the damp basement corridor. The cool air smelled faintly of heavy cardboard, ink, and fresh chemical preservatives. Gutierrez thrust his flashlight through the shattered opening, revealing row after row of gray steel filing cabinets. The clerk watched the masonry crumble, his face tightening as he crossed his arms over his chest. He declared that the soldiers were interfering with an official state archive that was strictly protected by legal mandate. He asserted that the meticulous records inside were maintained entirely for internal state accountability and legal administrative clarity. Gutierrez reached through the gap, pulling open the closest metal drawer and retrieving a thick manila folder. He opened the file, reading the top transport manifest aloud, detailing names, origins, and arrival dates. He pointed to a final column on the ledger, where every single name was followed by the stamped phrase indicating special treatment completed. The clerk stepped forward, his voice rising with defensive pride as he gestured toward the cabinets. He explained that every form was properly completed, every necessary signature was obtained, and every single delivery was officially confirmed. He claimed that the regional office was merely following explicit instructions and ensuring that the entire program was executed with total organizational precision. Gutierrez closed the thick folder, his jaw tightening as he looked at the thousands of indexed names stretching down the dark room. He turned away from the clerk, instructing his radio operator to contact headquarters. Immediately, the report reached Patton within the hour. Patton's jeep pulled up to the gate, 4 stars on his helmet, ivory revolvers on his belt. The general walked in unannounced. Every man in the room snapped to attention as his boots echoed against the damp concrete floor. He did not look at the walls or the shattered brickwork. He looked directly at the gray steel filing cabinets stretching into the darkness. His presence filled the small room, freezing the air faster than the climate control system. He did not raise his voice. His tone was ice. Patton studied the regional administrator. He asked who was responsible for maintaining these files. House. Brenner stepped forward, straightening his tailored wool suit, and stated that he was the senior director of the archive. Patton asked if every name in the drawers had been recorded under his personal supervision. Brenner nodded, asserting that his office took great pride in total organizational clarity. Patton asked what the final column on the ledger meant when it noted that special treatment was completed. Brenner blinked, replying that it simply meant the administrative process had been finalized according to regulations. Patton looked at the open folder in his hand. He noted that the administrator spoke of process while standing in a library of murder. He stated that the regime had built a climate-controlled vault to preserve the evidence of its own horrific cruelty because it valued bureaucracy over human life. He compared the meticulous indexing of thousands of victims to an ordinary payroll ledger, highlighting the absolute sickness of a system that treated genocide like a standard tax return. He contrasted this cold administrative efficiency with the reality of the families whose lives were destroyed and filed away in steel boxes. He looked Brenner in the eyes and gave him a choice. He could either cooperate fully by indexing every single signature for the coming War Crimes Tribunal, or he could be locked inside this exact basement vault alongside his precious paperwork until the courts arrived. Patton stated that the man who lived by the file would now be judged by the file. Brenner looked at the cold steel of the cabinets, his administrative arrogance instantly vanishing as his hands began to tremble. He looked at the guards, then back at the general, and silently nodded his compliance. Patton gestured to his security detachment with a sharp flick of his wrist. 4 military policemen stepped forward, their heavy combat boots ringing against the concrete as they unholstered their service pistols. They grabbed Brenner by his tailored wool sleeves, pulling him away from his pristine desk and forcing him deep into the narrow aisles of the hidden vault. The chilled, dry air stung the administrator's face as the heavy iron door groaned on its hinges behind him. He looked around at the cold gray steel cabinets, realizing he was now trapped in the very archive he had spent years meticulously organizing. The guard slammed the massive vault door shut, throwing the iron bolt into place with a heavy, definitive clang that echoed through the basement foundation. Witnesses in the corridor, from low-level local clerks to veteran American infantrymen, stood in absolute silence as the lock turned. Brenner could hear nothing but the faint, mechanical hum of the climate control system, keeping his paperwork preserved in the dark. He was left alone with the thousands of names he had filed away as finished business. The man who had reduced human lives to neat columns on a ledger was now just another body trapped inside the repository of his own cold crimes. First Lieutenant Thomas Gutierrez returned to San Antonio, Texas, after the end of hostilities, completing his structural engineering degree and establishing a successful civilian architecture firm. He lived a quiet life with his family, rarely discussing the technical observation that uncovered the hidden basement archive in the Erfurt Administrative Building. He kept a small, blank piece of manila folder cardstock on his study desk as a permanent reminder of the thousands of names he helped save from historical erasure. He died in his hometown in 1988, remembered by his colleagues as a man who always measured twice. Regierungsrat Helmut Brenner was transferred to the War Crimes Detention Facility at Nuremberg later that year, where he spent months cataloging the signatures and stamps of his former regional network. His meticulous understanding of the archive's cross-referencing system became a foundational asset for the prosecution during the subsequent military tribunals. He was convicted of administrative complicity in regional war crimes and served a 12-year prison sentence before being released in 1958. He returned to a quiet civilian life in Berlin, working as a standard commercial bookkeeper until his death in 1973, always maintaining that he had simply done his job. General George Patton never mentioned the hidden climate-controlled archive, in his public speeches or interviews, keeping the military intelligence report filed in his personal field desk until his fatal accident in December 1945. He noted the incident only once in a private diary entry written the night after his visit to the basement near Erfurt. He wrote that the true horror of the enemy was not found in their desperate battlefield aggression, but in their orderly filing cabinets. Some historians have argued that General Patton's immediate extrajudicial confinement of civilian administrators went far beyond his authorized military mandate and bypassed the established framework of international legal protocols. These critics suggest that securing the perimeter and waiting for professional war crimes investigators would have better preserved the formal chain of evidence. Others have argued the opposite, insisting that his swift, uncompromising intervention prevented the immediate destruction of crucial regional documentation by desperate remnants of the collapsing regime. What is certain is that the physical preservation of the Erfurt archive provided the Nuremberg tribunals with an unassailable mountain of systematic evidence that no defendant could ever deny. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have sealed the room and locked the bureaucrat inside? Or would you have left the investigation entirely to the legal specialists? Let us know in the comments, and if you want more stories about the evidence no order could erase, make sure to subscribe.